Hello and welcome. Today we are going to explore into a topic that is perhaps one of the most critically in modern nutrition and medicine. This is the chapter 7, inflammation and its role in the pathophysiology of a chronic disease. We will be exploring why diseases that were rare a century ago are now common and how inflammation serves as the common. So our goal is to understand the why behind the chronic illness and to equip ourselves with the knowledge to address it at its roots. So in this lecture, in this chapter 7, there is 4 sections. The first, epidemic of a chronic disease. The second, concepts of chronic disease, pathophysiology, common denominator of a chronic disease, and the last, nutrients modulator of inflammation. So let's start with this section number 1, the epidemic of a chronic disease. So it's crucial to understand that epidemic of a chronic disease is a relatively new problem in the grand scheme of the human history. So its widespread recognition really only began after the Second World War, which not coincidentally was the same time that major nutrition transition began to occur, first in industrialized nations and then globally. So the statistics are staggering. In the United States, an incredible 90% of healthcare dollars are spent in managing chronic disease. So, and this is not just financial burden. We're saying that while lifespans may be increasing, the number of years people spend living with disability has also increased. So this means we are living longer but not necessarily healthier lives. A key characteristics of these diseases is their long incubation period. So they can develop silently for years or even decades before becoming clinically apparent. So to truly grasp the urgency of this situation, so let's look at some projections from leading health organizations. When we use the word epidemic, so the question, is a chronic disease an epidemic? So word epidemic, we're not being hyperbolic. So according to the Center Disease Control and Prevention CDC and World Health Organization WHO, the numbers are alarming because by 2050 it's projected that 1 out of every 3 adults in the United States will have diabetes. Currently, 70% of all deaths in the United States will be from a chronic disease. So the vast majority of adults, 2 out of 3 will be overweight or obese. And looking globally, cancer rate could surge by 70% between 2015 and 2035. So what's perhaps most important for us as nutrition professionals is the last point. The 3 most preventable risk factors driving this crisis are unhealthy diet, smoking, and physical inactivity. So the 3 preventable risk factor driving this crisis are 1. Unhealthy diet, 2. Smoking, 3. Physical inactivity. This puts our work right at the center of the solution. I mentioned the nutrition transition just a moment ago. So let's break down what that actually means. Nutrition transition, as its primary driver of this epidemic. So the nutrition transition describes major shift in our environment and behaviors. It's characterized by several key changes. First, our food supply has been altered by technology that allows for the synthesis of new to nature molecules. Think trans fats and artificial additives that our bodies haven't evolved to process. Simultaneously, we have seen a rapid increase in our exposure to environmental toxins. So our lifestyle have become increasingly sedentary with marked decrease in physical activity. And our eating habits have transformed also. There has been significant decrease in home cooking, replaced by a reliance on convenience food, processed food, and eating out. Finally, this has all ended in a massive increase in the consumption of the sugar and high sugar containing food. So these changes have fundamentally altered our biology. So to understand how, we need to familiarize ourselves with some core concept of pathophysiology. So let's review them. Section 2, concepts of chronic disease, pathophysiology. So before we can effectively tackle chronic disease, we need to speak the same language. This slide lists the eight fundamental concepts that form the modern framework for understanding the chronic pathophysiology: system biology, allostasis, autophagy, health continuum, genesis of disease, long latency, nutrient insufficiencies, triage theory, and finally nutrient barter principles. So these 8 concepts move us away from the simple single cause view of disease and toward more holistic, interconnected understanding of health. So let's start with the broadest of these concepts. The first one, system biology. System biology represents a major patterns shift in medicine and healthcare. It moves away from a reductionist approach where you look at one organ or one pathway in isolation and instead focuses on the whole. So the core principle of system biology is that all body systems are interconnected and work interdependently. So it's an interdisciplinary field that brings together biology, computer science, and physics to study the complex interaction within biological system. For us practitioners, this means adopting a holistic and personalized approach, recognizing that a problem in the gut, for example, can manifest as a problem in the brain or in the skin. So now let's consider how these interconnected systems maintain stability, which brings us to the concept of allostasis. So allostasis is the process by which body maintains metabolic stability by making physiological changes in the response to environmental influence and stresses. So think of it as the body's ability to adapt and find a new normal to survive. So however, this adaptation comes at a cost. When these physiological changes are maintained over a long period, they can lead to wear and tear on the body. A perfect example of an allostatic adaptation is the inflammation. In the short term, it's life-saving response. But when it becomes chronic, as we see in obesity, it causes tissue damage and promotes conditions like insulin resistance and endothelial dysfunction. So while allostasis is about adapting to external stress, so the next concept, number 3, is autophagy, is about maintaining order from within. So autophagy literally translates to self-eating. It is a fundamental cellular process of survival and health. So essentially, it is the body internal housekeeping and recycling program. So autophagy allows cell to clean up. This means cellular debris, things like damaged organelles, unfolded protein, or foreign materials that accumulate during normal metabolic activity. This process is absolutely essential for maintaining cellular homeostasis, especially after stressors like infections or mitochondrial damage. When this clean-up system is faulty, it's known as a defect in autophagy. And studies have shown this can directly result in pathological inflammation and contribute to disease. So now that we have looked at the body's internal process, so let's examine the external factor that indicate disease, which lead us to genesis of the disease: the health continuum. Health continuum is measured of a continuum from birth to death. So chronic disease management for an individual must include considering the entire health continuum history to determine which factor along the way relate to one's current health condition. When collecting the patient's history during the assessment, plotting the personal health milestone as they relate to major life events can be helpful. This is often referred to as a health timeline. So the genesis of disease, to understand the origin or genesis of the disease in an individual, we use 3 key terms: antecedents, triggers, and mediator. Antecedents are the factors that set the stage. They are the congenital or developmental aspects of an individual, like their gender, family history, unique genomics. They create the predisposition. While triggers are the specific events or entities that provoke the disease or its symptoms. So this could be an infection, a toxin exposure, or a major life stressors. The mediators are intermediate that actually drives the disease process forward. These are primarily biochemical molecules like cytokines or prostaglandins, which are the direct agents of the inflammatory process. Often the stage for disease is set not by a sudden event but by a slow simmering problem over many years. So this is the idea behind long latency nutrient insufficiencies. So this is the concept number 6. So this concept is critically important for nutritional professional. So long latency nutrient insufficiencies refer to subclinical or below optimum, so nutrient level that result from chronic poor dietary intake. These are not the dramatic acute deficiencies you read about in all textbook. Instead, they contribute to the development of chronic diseases slowly over decades. So the classic example help to illustrate this. Complete lack of vitamin C causes scurvy, obvious and deadly disease within the months. In contrast, years of having subclinical vitamin C deficiency, not enough to cause scurvy, but still below optimal, can lead to a much less recognizable problem like periodontal gum disease. This silent progression of damage is a hallmark of how modern chronic disease develop. So it's our bodies are experiencing these subtle insufficiencies. How do they decide where to allocate the limited resources? This is explained by the triage theory. This is the concept number 7. So the triage theory proposed by the biochemist, by scientist Bruce Ames, offers fascinating explanation of how the bodies manage nutrient scarcity. So the theory states that when dietary supply of a nutrient is poor, the body has built-in regulating mechanism. So it prioritizes using those scarce nutrients for functions that are absolutely essential for immediate survival and reproduction. So what Ames call survival nutrients? This makes perfect evolutionary sense. So the consequence, however, is that functions needed to protect against future damage, our long-term health and wellness, are sacrificed. So the scientist Bruce Ames, refer to the nutrients for these functions are or as longevity nutrient. So over time, this sacrifice of long-term maintenance accelerates the risk of disease associated with aging. So the idea of rationing and prioritization highlights how interconnected nutrients are. No nutrients work in a vacuum, which brings us to our next concept, the concept number 8, the nutrient partner principle. So in this concept builds on the foundation of nutrient balance. It emphasizes the nutrients have synergistic relationship and often work in teams. So consuming one nutrient in isolation without considering its partners can lead to imbalance. So a perfect and how widely recognized example is the relationship between calcium, vitamin D, and magnesium. For years, people were told to take high doses of calcium for bone health, but we now know that without adequate vitamin D for absorption and magnesium for proper utilization, that calcium may not be effective and could even be problematic. So this principle reminds us to always think about the whole picture of a person's nutrient intake, not just single nutrient. So to illustrate this further, let's look at some of the most well-known nutrient partnership. Let's start with calcium, magnesium, vitamin D, and vitamin K, which all work together for bone health. The balance between omega-3 also and omega-6 fatty acids is a central theme of today because, especially in this lecture, as it governs inflammation. While sodium chloride and potassium as electrolyte work together to regulate fluid balance and blood pressure. On the other hand, vitamin B2, vitamin B12, cyanocobalamin, and folic acid are key partners in the methylation cycle, which is crucial for everything from DNA repair to neurotransmitters production. So niacin and tryptophan also have an interdependent relationships, as the body can synthesize niacin from the amino acids tryptophan. And zinc and copper must be in the balance. An excess of one, for example in zinc, can create deficiency in the other for the copper. So many of these partnerships, especially the fatty acids, are essential to managing what we have identified as a common denominator of a chronic disease, the inflammation. Now let's start with the section number 3, common denominator of chronic disease. So now we arrive the core of our topics, inflammation. Inflammation is the common thread that links nearly all chronic disease. But what is it? At its most basic level, inflammation is completely naturally and healthy reaction of our immune system. It's our body's primary response to injury, to infection, or other harmful stimuli. So during this response, the immune system produces signaling molecules called adipokines and cytokines to coordinate the healing process. The system is designed to turn on, address the threat, and then turn off. So the problem arises when the underlying cause of inflammation isn't resolved. When that happens, the immune system can get stuck in the on position, leading a state of prolonged or chronic inflammation. So let's review the 5 classic signs of acute inflammation. These 5 cardinal signs of inflammation were first documented by the ancient Roman physician Aulus Cornelius Celsus nearly 2000 years ago. They describe the classic acute inflammatory response. Let's start with the first. Dolor means pain, which is Latin, and calor meaning heat, rubor or redness, tumor, which means swelling, and finally functionalisa, which translate to injured or lost function. So while these signs are obvious in an acute injury like a sprained ankle, the inflammation in a chronic disease is often much more subtle. So this brings us to the distinction between acute and prolonged inflammation. So prolonged or chronic inflammation, also known as chronic or non-resolving inflammation, is fundamentally different from the acute response. It is characterized by the stimulus destruction and healing of tissue over a long period. This state plays a primary role in the development of nearly all major chronic disease, including cardiovascular disease, cancer, and diabetes. A key feature is that in its early stages, this inflammation is often subclinical. It's frequently referred to as silent inflammation because it remains below the threshold of a clinical diagnosis, causing damage for years before symptoms become apparent. Since this type of inflammation is silent, how do we detect it? We look for specific biomarkers in the blood. So in this table highlights some of the key lab markers we can use to assess person's level of systemic inflammation. I have selected just a few of the most common ones here in this table. Let's start with high sensitive C-reactive protein, specifically the CRP, high sensitive, is general marker of systemic inflammation and is often elevated in response to the infection, response to trauma, or from visceral adipose tissue. The second one, homocysteine. Homocysteine is an amino acid and high level can indicate a blockage in the methylation cycle, which is often tied to inflammation and deficiency in B vitamin cofactor like B6 and B12 and folate also. Number 3, fasting insulin level. When elevated are strong indicator of insulin resistance, which is both a cause and consequence of inflammation. While the erythrocyte sedimentation rates is a non-specific but very useful marker that is often elevated in autoimmune condition and chronic infections. So let's go down in this table to tumor necrosis factor alpha. Is a potent inflammatory cytokine involved in wide range conditions from Alzheimer to inflammatory bowel disease. So these individual markers are helpful, but to get a full picture we need to think about all contributing factors together. This is conceptualized as the total inflammatory loads. So in this figure provide a powerful visual model for a concept called total inflammatory load. So think a person's capacity to handle inflammation like a container. So the total inflammatory load is a way of conceptualizing all different factors that are pouring into this container. As you can see, the inputs are diverse. They can include like infections, trauma, antigens, from food, from environment, autoimmune process, stress and toxins, lack of sleeps, and poor lifestyle habits. All of these feed into the central immune system, and the output is the person's overall level of inflammation. So when inputs overwhelm the body's ability to resolve them, the container overflows and we see the manifestation of a chronic disease. So let's spend some time breaking down each of these contributing factors, starting with the input of the left side of this diagram, the antigen. So as we just saw in this figure, the total inflammatory load is multifactorial concepts. So the major contributes we will discuss more details include antigen, include genomics, body composition, energy dysregulation, microbiome, hypercoagulation, infections, and lifestyle that contain stress and sleep, etc. So the antigen, which are foreign substances that trigger the immune system response, genomics, or an individual unique genetic predisposition, body composition, particularly the amount and location of the body fat, energy dysregulation, which relates to the health of our mitochondria, microbiome, or the community of microbes living in and on our bodies, hypercoagulation, an increase in the viscosity or thickness of the body fluids, and finally the infections, especially those that are chronic or subclinical. So let's begin by looking more closely at body composition act as it's one of the most significant modifiable factor. So body composition and sarcopenic obesity. When we talk about body composition and inflammation, we are moving far beyond the simple body mass index or BMI. So what's critically important is not just the amount of body fat, but its location and type. So the most concerning type is visceral adipose tissue, which is the fat stored deep within the abdominal cavity around the organs. We now understand that visceral adipose tissue is not just inert storage tissue, it is highly active endocrine organ that secretes a host of inflammatory adipokines, including resistin, leptin, and tumor necrosis factor alpha. This inflammatory burden from visceral adipose tissue contribute to another serious condition called sarcopenia, which is the progressive loss of muscle mass and strength. When you have both high visceral fat and low muscle mass, the condition is known as sarcopenic obesity, which represents a particularly high risk metabolic states. So let's visualize what these different body composition phenotypes looks like. Clinically inside sarcopenic obesity, this chart based on the work of the scientists Bardo and his colleagues gives us a way to classify different body composition phenotypes based on the two metric: the fat mass index, kilogram per meter square on the x-axis, and the appendicular skeletal mass index ASMI on the y-axis. In the top of left, we have low adiposity, high muscle mass, which is a very healthy profile. In the bottom left, we have low adiposity, low muscle mass, sometimes referred to as skinny fat. In the top of right, we have high adiposity, high muscle mass. Think of a professional strong man or lean man. But the most metabolically unhealthy quadrant is the bottom right, high adiposity and low muscle mass, HALM. This represents sarcopenic obesity and carries the highest risk of chronic inflammatory disease. This unhealthy body composition is often tied to another underlying issue problem with energy production at the cellular level. At the very heart of cellular health and inflammation is energy production, which happens in our mitochondria. A key underlying factor in inflammation is compromised mitochondrial production of adenosine triphosphate or ATP, which is the body essential energy currency. So when our mitochondria are dysfunctional, they cannot produce enough ATP, leading to cascade of problems including muscle weakness, organ dysfunction, and weakened immune system. From clinical perspective, the single most common symptoms or phenotypic expression of mitochondrial dysfunction is the patient complaint of chronic fatigue. Just as our cell form an ecosystem with our body itself hosts a massive ecosystem of microbes. So let's discuss the role of the microbiome. So microbiome and enteroimmunology. The human microbiome, the vast community of bacteria, viruses, and fungi living in and on us, is a major frontier in medicine. We now know that any disturbance or loss of diversity in this delicate community can be a powerful factor in promoting prolonged inflammation. So this is especially true in the gut. An incredible 70% of our entire immune system is located in the gastrointestinal tract, in what's called the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, or GALT, because the gut is the central hub of the immunity. A new field of study has emerged called enteroimmunology, which focuses specifically on diseases that are related to the interplay between the gut and the environment, or interplay between gut environment and the immune system. So this is the next that I will provide you a great overview of the far-reaching impact of the gut health. This diagram illustrated the central role of the gut in systemic health or systemic health. So what happens in an inflamed gut has potential to exacerbate inflammation throughout the entire body. Look at the left side. You can see a list of common non-specific symptoms that are often linked to what we call enteroimmune disease. These range from cognitive issue like mental and poor memory to emotional symptoms like anxiety and depression, and somatic complaints like fatigues and joint pain. While on the right we see a list of major neurological disease that are increasingly being associated with enteroimmunopathies, including autism, Alzheimer, Parkinson's, and multiple sclerosis. This really drives home the point that the gut is intimately connected to the brain and the rest of the body. So now perhaps the most direct way we can influence this entire system is through the nutrients we consume, particularly the type of fats. This brings us to the nutrient modulators of inflammation. Now we are going to discuss the section number 4, the final section in this lecture, nutrient modulator of inflammation. So this is where nutrition therapy becomes incredibly powerful. The entire inflammatory process is tightly regulated by class signaling molecules called icosanoid, which include prostaglandins and leukotrienes. So the production of these molecules begins with the icosanoid cascade, a series of enzymatic reactions. So this cascade starts with the 2 essential fatty acids we get from our diet. First, linoleic acids, the second alpha-linolenic acid. Linoleic acid, which is the parent of omega-6 fatty acids, while alpha-linolenic acids, the parent of omega-3 fatty acids. So crucially, the enzymes that converts these parent fat into powerful signaling molecules are dependent on rate-limiting cofactors, specifically vitamins like B6 and minerals like zinc and magnesium. So this cascade is complex. So let's look at detailed diagram to understand the K pathway. So in this figure of essential fatty acids, omega-6 fatty acids and omega-3 fatty acids pathway, this complex of biochemical activity is influenced by the diet and lifestyle, hormones, and genetics. So okay, this diagram looks complicated, but let's break down. It shows the 2 main arms of the icosanoid cascade. One of the left, we have omega-6 pathway starting from linoleic acid from the diet, and the right we have the omega-3 pathway starting from or with alpha-linolenic acid. Follows the arrow down, you can see these parent fats are converted by a series of enzymes, the desaturases, and elongases, into various downstream metabolites. The key takeaway is that omega-6 pathway can lead to both anti-inflammatory products like prostaglandin E1 and highly pro-inflammatory products like prostaglandin E2, which comes from arachidonic acid. So the omega-3 fatty acids pathway, in contrast, leads to primarily to anti-inflammatory products like prostaglandin E3. So notice the list of a nutrient cofactor in the middle: magnesium, vitamins, zinc, vitamin A. Without these, none of these conversion can happen efficiently. So let's look at the slightly simplified version of this pathway that highlights the K gene involved. In this figure simplifies the pathway and adds an important layer, the genetics. The K enzymatic in this cascade, the desaturase and elongase enzyme, are encoded by FAD S1, FAD, S2, AL, VL5, ALOVL5, and FADS1 and FADS2. So these enzymes, the variations in these genes can make an individual more or less efficient at converting these fatty acids. For example, a person with less active of FADS2 gene might have a very hard time converting plant-based alpha-linolenic acid into a powerful anti-inflammatory fats, eicosapentaenoic acid and eicosahexaenoic acid. So this is a perfect example of nutrigenomics, where an individual's genetics influence their nutrient needs. So the balance between these two pathways, omega-3 and omega-6, is what ultimately determines a person's inflammatory state. So this balance is often discussed in terms of the prostaglandin series. So prostaglandin series, the balancing act. So to summarize the output of that complex cascade, we can think of it as producing three main families of prostaglandin, which act like a set of metabolic switches: prostaglandin E1 or PGE1, prostaglandin E2 or PGE2, and prostaglandin 3 PGE3. Prostaglandin E1, this series derived from DGLA omega-6 metabolites, and it is a primary anti-inflammatory, while prostaglandin E2, this series is derived from arachidonic acid, another omega-6 metabolites. While it has some necessary function when it is produced in excess, it is highly pro-inflammatory. So this is the pathway that most anti-inflammatory drugs like aspirin. On the other hand, prostaglandin E3 or PGE3, this series is derived from the omega-3 fatty acids or eicosapentaenoic acid, and it is strongly anti-inflammatory compared to omega-6. The goal of a nutrition therapy is to shift the balance away from the pro-inflammatory and toward the anti-inflammatory, from BGE2 to BGE1 and BGE3. But the story doesn't end there. In recent years, a new class of molecules has been discovered that actively turn inflammation off. So this is the ground-breaking area, the resolving inflammation. The ground-breaking area of this research, or for the research in general, for a long time it was thought that inflammation just passively faded away. We now know that's not true. The resolution of inflammation is an active programmed process driven by a class of molecules called specialized pro-resolving mediator, or SPMs. So keep it. These powerful lipid molecules are derived from both omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, include eicosapentaenoic acid, eicosahexaenoic acid, and even arachidonic acid. So their job is to initiate the resolution phase of inflammation effectively, telling the immune system that the threat is gone and it's time to clean up and return to homeostasis. So the major families of SPMs include lipoxin, resolvins, protectins, and mersins. A failure to produce enough SPMs is now thought to be a key reason why inflammation can become chronic. So the production of both prostaglandin and SPMs depend entirely on the balance of fats in our diet. So let's look at how the balance has shifted. So omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. What is the best ratio? The balance between omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids in the human diet has changed dramatically. The diet of our inherited humans, on which our genes were programmed, is believed to have had ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 was close 1:1. In contrast, the typically modern Western diet, which is heavy in processed seed oils and grain-fed meats, has a ratio that is estimated to be somewhere between 10:1 and sometimes 21:1. So this extreme imbalance heavily favors the pro-inflammatory prostaglandin E2 pathway from arachidonic acids and is now strongly linked to the epidemic of chronic disease. So this imbalance is made worse by bottlenecks in our own biochemistry, specifically with a K enzyme. So the K enzyme delta 6 desaturase, the primary bottleneck in the icosanoid cascade, is the very first enzyme, delta 6 desaturase. This enzyme is responsible for the first conversion step in both the omega-6 and omega-3 pathway. Of all the steps, this one is the least efficient. So several common factors can make this already slow enzymes even less efficient. So first, the high intake of linoleic acids in the Western diet can overwhelm and inhibit the enzyme. Second, hyperinsulinemia or high level of insulin, which is a hallmark of metabolic syndrome, is known to impair its function. And third, this enzyme is heavily dependent on a nutrient cofactor. A deficiency in zinc, vitamin B6, or magnesium will further slow it down. So beyond the fatty acids, other K nutrients play a powerful modulatory roles. So let's start with one of the most important, vitamin D. So vitamin D is much more than just vitamin for bone health. It actually functions as powerful pro-hormone that modulates hundreds of genes. It plays a crucial role in both hormone regulation and immune modulation, and it exhibits multiple direct anti-inflammatory effects. Unfortunately, we are currently facing what many researchers call a global epidemic of low vitamin D status. So low levels are associated with higher prevalence of many chronic diseases. It's also important to remember the nutrient partner principle here. Vitamin D works synergistically with vitamin A. They share common receptors, and the function of one can be affected by a status of the other. So let's continue with the two essential minerals, also the critical for controlling inflammation: magnesium and zinc. Magnesium is a power horse. It's involved in over 300 different enzyme systems in the body, and its blood level are known to be inversely correlated with C-reactive protein, meaning as magnesium goes up, inflammation goes down. So despite its important data from research has revealed that up to 80% of the United States population may have magnesium intake below the recommended daily allowance. On the other hand, zinc is also a cofactor of over 300 enzymes also. It is particularly critically for the immune function. A zinc deficiency can lead a thymic atrophy, shrinking of the thymus gland, which impairs the production of T lymphocytes, a vital part of our immune defense. So finally, let's look at the broad class of plant compound that have a powerful anti-inflammatory effects. Flavonoids and antioxidants. Flavonoids are a large family of phytonutrients, the compounds that give fruits and vegetables their vibrant color. They have potent anti-inflammatory and antioxidant function. Two of the most well-researched examples are curcumin, the active compound in the spice, turmeric, and quercetin, the flavonoids found in food like citrus, like apples and onions. These compounds are a part of the body broader defense system against oxidative stress, which is handled by antioxidant network. This is a synergistic team of molecules including vitamin C, including vitamin E, glutathione, lipoic acid, and coenzyme Q10 that work together to neutralize damaging reactive oxygen species and quell inflammation. So of course, our health is not just determined but what we eat. Our daily habits and lifestyle play an enormous role. Let's explore some of these key lifestyle modulators. So we simply cannot overstate the importance of sleep. The CDC has gone so far as to label sleep insufficiency a major public health challenge, with 50 to 70 million United States adults suffering from sleep disorder. So the connection to inflammation is direct and well documented. So studies shows that getting adequate good quality sleep helps to reduce blood markers of inflammation, most notably C-reactive protein. Conversely, poor sleep raises inflammation markers and can contribute directly to a host of chronic diseases, including weight gain, hypertension, heart disease, and diabetes. So along with rest, movement is another pillar to a healthy lifestyle. So let's look at physical activity. The link between physical activity and inflammation is generally very positive. It is often associated with significant improvement in inflammatory markers. So multiple large-scale studies have demonstrated an inverse relationship between regular physical activity and level inflammatory markers like high-sensitive C-reactive protein and tumor necrosis factor alpha. This means that, as a rule, the more active people are, the lower their inflammation. It is worth noting, however, that some studies suggest that anti-inflammatory benefits may be population but the overall health benefits of being active are indisputable. So a fascinating and often overlooked player that connects our brain, our guts, and our inflammatory response is the vagus nerve. What is vagus nerve? So the vagus nerve is the longest cranial nerve in the body, acting as a superhighway of information connecting the brain to many different organs, especially in the gut. It is the primary regulator of our parasympathetic or rest and digest nervous system. So its role in inflammation is profound. One of the vagus nerve's most important functions is controlling the promotion of those specialized pro-solving mediators, or SBMs, that we talked about earlier in this lecture. So it actively signals for the resolution of inflammation. So therefore, poor vagal tone from vagal nerve can impair the body's ability to turn inflammation off. So the good news is that we can improve vagal tone through simple lifestyle intervention like meditation, yoga, deep breathing, and laughing. So finally, let's consider two major external inputs to our inflammatory load: stress and toxins. Stress and toxins load, these are two of the most powerful drivers of inflammation in the modern world. Chronic, prolonged, unresolved stress is a primary promoter of early aging and chronic disease. It keeps the fight or flight system constantly activated, which triggers the immune system to pump out inflammatory cytokines. The toxin load refers to our exposure to harmful substances. Since the Second World War, over 80,000 synthetic new-to-nature chemicals have been released into our environment. So our bodies have no evolutionary experience with these compounds, and they can significantly damage our immune and metabolic system. So it is also crucial to acknowledge the concept of environmental racism, which highlights the significant disparities in the toxic exposure faced by people of low socioeconomic status and communities of color, linking these exposures directly to higher rates of inflammatory conditions. So we have covered the concepts, the mechanisms, and the contributing factor. So now, how do we put this all together in a clinical setting? It starts with the assessment. So nutritional assessment process, when viewed through this lens, becomes a form of detective work. So our primary goal is to partner with the client to uncover the root cause of their physiological imbalances, including inflammation. So the most important source of clues is the patient's history. This goes beyond simple diet recall. It's comprehensive collection of data from personal interviews, medical record, and family history. A powerful tool in this process is creating a timeline of major life events and health challenges. This can reveal pattern and connection. For example, the onset of an autoimmune conditions after major stressful event or a severe infection that help us understand a unique genesis of that individual disease. So alongside this narrative history, we need objective data. So let's look at the role of medical history and lab work. When reviewing a patient's medical history and lab work, we are looking of patterns that point to underlying inflammation. A key pattern to recognize is a cluster of risk factor known as metabolic syndrome. This includes insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, increased visceral adipose tissue, often measured by waist circumference, elevated blood triglyceride, and lower HDL, hypertension, and rise the fasting glucose. Beyond this, we look at the direct inflammatory markers like high sensitive C-reactive protein and erythrocyte sedimentation rate. And increasingly, we can use predictive genomics testing to look like those in the vitamin D receptors gene that might indicate genetic predisposition we need to support nutritional. Once we have this comprehensive assessment, we can build an intervention. So, how we manage inflammation? Managing the inflammation effectively requires an integrated, multi-pronged approach that puts food and lifestyle at the foundation. At the base of the pyramids is food. This means emphasizing a whole food diet that is rich in beneficial fats and phytonutrients, like at the Mediterranean Asian diet. It also means ensuring adequate hydration and minimizing exposure of the food antigens and toxins. So the next level is about lifestyle. As we have discussed, this includes prioritizing rest and sleep, engaging in the regular physical activity, actively managing stress, and fostering strong community and social relationships. At the top of the pyramid, we have targeted nutraceutical. When indicated by through assessment specific phytonutrients like quercetin and curcumin, as well as prebiotic and probiotic, can be used therapeutically to support the body's healing process. Now, let's conclude with a summary of our key takeaway from today's lecture. Let's review the main point. First, the epidemic of a chronic disease is deeply affected by a diet and lifestyle, and the common denominator linking most of these conditions is sustained low-grade inflammation. RDN registered dietitian nutritionist, we have a vital role to play in the interdisciplinary management of these conditions. By developing the skills to recognize the early signs and symptoms of inflammation, we can identify nutritional priorities and create individualized strategies to reduce that inflammation and restore health. Ultimately, the foundational tool for achieving wellness are whole food, functional food, targeted dietary supplement when necessary, and profound lifestyle changes. An understanding of the immune and inflammatory response will empower you to make more effective assessment and create intervention that can truly change lives. Thank you and see you next lecture. Goodbye.